Hello, and welcome to a lecture on Chapter 6, Sensation and Perception. So, in this lecture, we will first discuss in Section 1 the differences between sensation and perception. Section 2 will then go into detail on the 5 traditional senses. In Section 3, we'll discuss the vestibular sense, proprioception, and kinesthesia, and of course, how they contribute to our balance, coordination, and spatial orientation. So we'll go ahead and get started with Section 1. And in this section, we're going to learn how we sense and perceive the world. Keep in mind, these are two distinct but associated processes that are responsible for detecting stimuli and cognitively processing them. Furthermore, there are specifications for how much stimulus is necessary for response. First, let's identify the difference between sensations and perceptions. And quite simply, it's literally the difference between external and internal. Sensation is a unit of data or of an experience produced by stimulation of sensory receptors that cause activations of specific brain centers. Perception, on the other hand, is the process of becoming aware of the sensations, i.e., sound, odor, color, shape, or taste taste, or temperature, pressure, pain, pleasure, hunger, thirst, nausea, and so on. Awareness and processing of these sense objects, relationships, and events, which includes activities as recognizing, observing, and discriminating, then enable organisms, us, to organize and interpret the stimuli received into meaningful knowledge and to act in a coordinated manner. For instance, when we feel that bug fly into our eye, we know to swat it, or if we smell a really gross smell, then we're probably going to shield our nose. It's also important to note that there's interdependence of these processes, which means that sensation is necessary for perception, but we could not perceive anything without our senses. Basically, your brain would not have any data to process without the sensory organs sending it information. So again, if I didn't say the interdependence exists in the fact that sensation is not necessarily for perception is not necessary for sensation. Sensation is necessary for perception. So we know there's 5 senses, but how many of you all have heard of ESP, a sixth sense? You think it's a legitimate experience? This term was coined by German physician Gustav Pagensteicher. And the sixth sense is claimed ability to receive information with the mind and not through one of the recognized physical senses. But despite considerable research, the existence of any of these modalities remains highly contentious, according to the American Psychological Association. There is no scientific consensus on whether or not it exists. Now, some people believe that ESP is a real phenomenon, while others believe that it's simply a matter of coincidence or wishful thinking. There have been many studies conducted on ESP, but of course the results have been mixed, where some studies have found evidence while others have not. But it's important to note that even if ESP is real, it's very likely a rare ability. But despite the lack of scientific evidence, many people will continue to believe in the ESP. And there are many reasons why people might believe in ESP, such as personal experiences, religious beliefs, or a desire to believe that there's more to life than what we can see and touch. But we should be critical thinkers, so we'll take a look at this clip featuring theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss as he discusses his position on ESP.
Lawrence, ESP parapsychology, 2 kinds of issues. One, what is the data like? Controversial, very small effect at best. Is it real? Problem one. I don't think anybody's going to solve that to get everybody to agree on that.
Yeah,
Problem
well,
two.
I don't accept
All right,
it's
let's
not
go to that.
controversial. But
I'm interested in problem 2. If it's real, how could it possibly work? But
Well,
if
I
you want to
agree
talk
that-
about problem 1, tell me.
well, let's start with problem 1, and then I've spent a lot of time thinking about problem 2 because I think that's what, as a physicist, that's the question you want to ask.
All right.
But the the reason people are fascinated, the reason you're fascinated by it, and I have been, is we all kind of want there to be more out there than meets the eye.
Right.
That's
Sure.
the
All right.
that's behind a lot of science. In fact, I even wrote a whole book about it.
Right.
I think we wish, we look around the universe and we think, wouldn't it be great? We can sense emotions. We have animals and they have empathy, and we all wish that, because the universe of our experience is kind of is pretty bad at times.
Yeah,
We'd
we
like
live and
it-
we die.
Yeah, exactly. And we'd all want there to be more out there.
Right.
And so since we can, I can sense if you're happy or sad in a sense. Maybe just I can read your thoughts. And so it's always temptingly just beyond the edge of measurement. But of course, the one thing I want to say is that it's not controversial at all. There's no scientific evidence for extrasensory perception. And I think that alone doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means there's no positive evidence for it. But the second question that you asked is more interesting. So if ESP were going to be true, what would be required? And that's kind of what people don't realize is that that while we have 5 senses that we know of, and we therefore think there could be lots of things we can't see. We've developed technologies that allow us to see things that are unbelievably small. And so let's just take the first thing being that many people who argue for ESP don't realize is that everything we know of falls off with distance. If you're thinking and somehow your thoughts are generating something, it should be easier for me to detect them here than on the other side of this lagoon.
Right.
Okay, and there's no evidence of fall off
Right.
in
Even the people in ESP tell you there's no fall off.
Exactly, and that's right, and that already makes it suspect. But then the question is, okay, if you're generating some signals, what signals are you generating that I could detect? Well, the first thing you might think of is that, the brain currents are involved in the brain, electric charges, electromagnetic waves. We're generating electromagnetic signals. Great, except there's nothing more detectable than electromagnetic signals. With the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico, we could detect a light bulb on Jupiter. Okay, we can detect electromagnetic signals that are incredibly weak. So if your brain were generating something that I should be able to detect, then we could be able to detect sensors that would detect even the smallest possible electromagnetic signals that should be coming to me as detectable electromagnetic waves. We don't. Therefore, whatever brain waves you're sending that I should be able to detect are not electromagnetic in origin.
I think what you're doing is absolute and for sure, but it does not eliminate ESP. What it eliminates is one methodology how ESP can be transmitted, and it basically says it does. If it's true, it doesn't conform to the physical law that we know.
Okay, but
now
now
that may not be true at all, but
let's go to the
that's
other
all you say.
extreme. Okay, that's what that's saying. But I'm going to convince you. Just relax.
Okay.
Okay. So now, let's say it generates something so minuscule that no detector I could develop could detect it. Well, now there's a problem there, and it's a central problem of physics. You can't have your cake and eat it too. For example, we can detect particles called neutrinos. I've spent a lot of time thinking about neutrinos. These weird particles that are going right through your body as we're speaking here, generated by the sun. They go right through the Earth on average without interacting once.
Go through a light year of lead.
A light year of lead, in fact. But yet we can detect them.
Yeah.
We can build detectors that nevertheless have shown that they exist. So that's amazing. That means we can detect things that are so weakly interacting that they could not be possibly the carriers of ESP, because if your mind generated neutrinos, most of them would go right through my head without ever detecting. And it's a sense of, well, if you can generate something that's extremely weak, yes, it could escape all sensors. But if it was extremely weak, then my brain, which is nothing other than a sensor, wouldn't be able to detect it. So you see, the weaker you make it so that it avoids all empirical bounds, the less likely it will be effective as a form of communication. As I say, neutrinos would be the best thing you could think of for weakly emitted signals, but then I need a brain the size of a light year to be certain to be able to detect your signals. So the weaker you make it and the more it avoids empirical bounds, the less effective it is as a communication technique.
Some would say also that it's independent of time, that you're able to have precognition and know the future in the same way that you can know distance.
Yeah, but I've given an argument why that's not the case. And that is that there's so few billionaires on Earth, right? Because if I could know the future a day from today, then I would just have to invest a little bit of money to know stocks that increase by 2%.
Okay.
And then within 2 years, I'd be richer than Bill Gates.
I totally agree with that. And here's the argument that I've been told by some of the leading researchers in the field.
Okay.
They say, at its best, ESP so slightly shifts chance that if you were the best in the world at it and went to Las Vegas, you would still lose all your money. You would just lose it slower.
Well, that's a nice argument that's given, but in fact, you don't. Compound interest works really nicely. You give me the smallest. You want to make it 1%. You want to make it 0.1%. You give me the number, and I'll tell you how to invest in the stock market.
Right.
And 1.001 to the nth power becomes a large number really quickly. So I don't buy that argument. It's just that argument is made by people who, over and over again, can't find any measurable phenomena, and therefore argue that it's so small we can't measure it. But to me,
what they're saying is you can measure it statistically through meta studies and combining all sorts of studies.
But none of the statistical studies have ever passed muster among those people who really like statistics.
I've heard it both sides.
I'd love it.
And I believe you because you're my friend, and you're very smart,
I'd love it
and
to
you're
be
a good
true.
scientist. I
No,
know.
the point is, and that's the other thing we have to remember. It's like the X-Files. We want to believe.
We want to believe.
And that's the biggest thing that experimentalists have to remember, is that anytime something happens to us, it seems significant.
Right, sure.
We have to allow for the possibility that it's just an accident.
Right,
I don't know if I told you my favorite Richard Feynman story, and I don't know if you want to hear it, but in this regard, Richard Feynman used to go up to people, and he'd say, "You won't believe what happened to me today. You won't believe what happened to me." And people say, "What?" He'd say, "Absolutely nothing." Because, you have a dream. Most of your dreams are nonsense. But once you have a dream that your friend is going to break their arm and they break their leg, you remember it. You think somehow you had precognition.
Right. But you don't know all the things that you didn't dream that didn't happen, which are almost infinite.
And I think the bottom line is that right now there's no statistical evidence. And if there were, I could use that as an argument to prove that you should be able to become infinitely wealthy in a measurably short time, or be able to do things, and there's been no evidence that's been the case. So, from my attitude, there's no evidence for it that's compelling. And every time I think of a physical mechanism for it, it fails. It either should be measurable, or it isn't measurable because it won't work. And so, given all of that, it's highly unlikely. And I think that's the only thing a physicist can say, is that it's highly unlikely. I can't prove there isn't a teapot on the other side of the moon with tea in it right now, because I couldn't measure it. It's just highly unlikely.
So his argument here is that there's no convincing scientific evidence to support the existence of ESP. And if ESP were real, it would violate the laws of physics as we know them. But there's a possible explanation for all of the reported cases of ESP. Coincidence or wishful thinking, perhaps. Or it could be based in the fact that subconscious past experiences that creep up. So maybe you're confident that our five senses, are responsible for starting the process of perceiving the world, and they exist as they do through physical stimuli detection. But let's deconstruct the process using a visual example. So there are 4 steps necessary in changing sensory input into our own unique experiences. The first is that some physical stimulus has to occur, such as the changing color of a traffic light. That activates sensory receptors in the responsible organ. Sensory neurons, also known as receptors, are the part of the sensory organs that detect physical stimulation from the external world and change that stimulation into information that can be processed by the brain. In this case, our eyes are the sensory organs and cones are the sensory receptors. We'll touch on that more detail when we get to the section on vision. Now, once the receptors have completed their function, the process of transduction begins. Transduction occurs when sensory receptors convert physical stimuli into neural signals that the brain can interpret. In simple terms, transduction transforms external stimuli into a form the brain processes. So when you see a green traffic light, the green light stimulates the cones in your retina that are sensitive to green wavelengths. Transduction then occurs as the photoreceptors convert this light into electrical signals, and the shift in light wavelength from red to green activates a different set of photoreceptors, which generate action potentials. And these electrical signals travel along the optic nerve to the brain. Final step is perception. So once that signal reaches the brain's visual cortex, the process to recognize the change in color, and this transforms raw sensory input into meaningful experience. The brain is integrating this information with other regions to interpret the context. For instance, it's safe to proceed and initiate an action, such as pressing the gas pedal. After the brain processes this visual information and confirms the light is green, it sends signals through motor neurons to execute a response. And while this example focuses on vision, the same process applies to the other senses, such as hearing, tasting, smelling, and touching. Now, when discussing sensation, there must be specific amounts of stimulus to even be detected. So, when we're discussing the point of being at our baseline and becoming aware of stimulus, that sensation, we're referring to detection of thresholds. And there are two kinds. Let's compare. One is the absolute threshold. And so, this is the minimum amount of stimulation required to trigger a reaction or produce sensation 50% of the time. For instance, humans have been able to sense the following. They could taste 1 teaspoon of sugar and 2 gallons of water, see a candle flicker from about 30 miles away on a dark night, smell 1 drop of perfume spread over 6 rooms, feel the wing of a fly land on their cheek from 4/20ths of an inch away, and hear a clock tick from 20 feet away. Now, these thresholds are quite the anomaly. The average person probably can't do these phenomenons. Maybe this makes these people a bit of a superhero with have super activated senses. Nonetheless, those are quite the extreme. The other type is the difference threshold. So one absolute is to detect something, and the difference threshold, also referred to as the just noticeable difference, is the smallest difference between two stimuli that can consistently and accurately detect it on 50% of the trials. So if we have a baseline and we increase the exposure to that stimulus, how much does it take for us to notice that a difference had occurred? For instance, if you're listening to the radio on volume 5 and someone turns it up to volume 6 and you don't see them do it, could your ears detect that difference? Or if you're holding a bag of sand and someone throws a book on top of it, would you notice the weight difference? Now, we're better able to sense and perceive changes in a stimulus when the stimulus involves lower intensities, and that's according to Weber's law. So we'll take a look at this mathematical computation of the just noticeable difference.
Psychology in the fast lane. Difficult topics explained. The Weber fraction. The Weber fraction was named after the man who discovered it, a German physiologist with time on his hands named Ernst Weber. In studying touch, he found that the percentage of change necessary to perceive a difference between two different lifted weights remained the same across many varying weights. Long story short, he and many others after him determined that the amount of change that can be detected when lifting weights is 2% of the comparison weight. So for example, pretend you're lifting 100-pound bags of cement. Weber's fraction for weight predicts that if one of the bags had 2 pounds more cement in it, then you'd be able to tell it was heavier. But you could also demonstrate with pennies. Take 50 pennies and weigh them. You'll get 125 grams. That is, if they're all 1982 or newer. Weber's fraction, or the change you'll be able to detect if the comparison sample is 50 pennies, is 2% of 125 grams, or 2.5 grams. So if I take your pennies and bag them into 2 tissues, which is negligible added weight, and I put 50 in one and 51 in the other, and put the 2 bundles of pennies in your outstretched hands, You should be able to tell which one is heavier just by 1 penny difference, or by the Weber fraction for weight for this comparison.
So we talked about the components of sensation. Now we'll look at perception. So perception is the process of selecting and organizing sensory information into meaningful experiences. It's the process by which we make sense of the world around us. And there are two ways that our brains process sensory information. Top-down processing is driven by our expectations and prior experiences. For example, visually, when you read a sentence with missing letters, your brain fills in the gaps between based on your knowledge of language. For instance, what does a sentence say? Bottom-up processing is driven by the physical characteristics of the stimulus. In this type of example, say you're building a puzzle, and when you look at a jigsaw puzzle piece, you focus on details like colors, shapes, and patterns. And then you try to find other pieces that fit based on these details to properly construct it. Because, maybe you don't have the lid. But both top-down and bottom-up processing are important for perception. Bottom-up provides us with the raw sensory information that we need to perceive the world around us, and top-down helps us to interpret this information and make sense of it. By working together, these two systems allow us to make sense of the vast amount of sensory information that we're bombarded with on a daily basis. Some particular examples might be something like this. With hearing, when we hear a sound, our bottom-up processing system detects the basic features of the sound, such as the frequency, amplitude, and duration of it. Our top-down processing system then uses our existing knowledge and expectations about the world to interpret this information. So if you hear a loud bang, would you infer that it's a gunshot or a firework? Then with taste, when we taste our food, our bottom-up processing is detecting the basic taste qualities of it, such as sweetness, sour, saltiness. And our top-down processing is then using our existing knowledge and expectations about the food to interpret it. For example, if we taste something sweet, we may infer that it's a dessert, right? A piece of cake or a pie or something. Now, speaking of processing phenomena that contribute to our perceptions of the world, do you all recall these three German psychologists who fled Nazi Germany for the US that we introduced in chapter 1? This is Kohler, Kafka, and Wertheimer. And it was their contributions that led to a series of laws to explain how our brains group the perceived features of a visual scene into organized wholes. For instance, based on this image, what do you see when you look at the figure? Some people might see a younger woman. You might see the face with her ear, her jawline, and a black necklace. However, some of you are going to see the face of an older woman based on imagery such as an eye, a nose, and a black open mouth. Now, Gestalt psychology takes a holistic view, emphasizing that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Again, as Kafka famously stated, this means that our whole perception of the world is not simply a collection of individual sensations, but a unified, meaningful experience. And one of the core concepts of Gestalt psychology is the figure-ground relationship. And this principle suggests that our visual system naturally divides the world into objects, figures, and backgrounds. For example, when you look at a photograph, you immediately identify the main subject as the figure, while everything else becomes just part of the background. And the same phenomenon occurs when you all look at this image. The illusion demonstrates how the same visual information can be perceived differently depending on what is interpreted as the figure and what's interpreted as the ground. There's also another key aspect of Gestalt psychology, which is the grouping effect. Now, our visual system is adept at organizing features and regions into coherent, unified objects. And this allows us to perceive a continuous line or a complete shape, even when parts of it are missing or obscured. So this goes along with the quote from famous psychologist James Enns, who noted, "Very little of what we call seeing takes place in the eyes." This was further supported by Christopher Koch, made his point by emphasizing three things. Each eye has a blind spot where the optic nerve exits the retina. Additionally, the initial image that arrives in the brain is upside down, backward, and has a hole corresponding to the blind spot. The eyes make rapid movements, but we do not see or consciously perceive these rapid movements. We see with our eyes closed while dreaming as well, indicating that much of our visual experience is constructed by the brain. So we'll take a look at this short video that introduces some of the concepts of Gestalt psychology.
What do these images have in common? They all follow the laws of Gestalt psychology. It theorizes that humans observe objects as a whole and do not look at every detail when making sense of what's around us. There are 7 of Gestalt's laws. We'll focus on 3. Law of closure. Objects grouped together are seen as a whole. Here we see a triangle even though there is none. Law of prognose. Reality is often organized or reduced to the simplest form possible. When you look at this, you see a triangle and a square, right? That's your brain seeing the simplest form possible, which is too complicated for your brain to see naturally. Law of similarities. Items that are similar are grouped together. Everyone can see these circular shapes make up a flower. Gestalt theorizes that because the shapes are similar, that your brain wants to see them as a whole. Now that you've learned these theories on how humans conceptualize images, you can implement them into your own art. Thanks for watching!
So that video highlighted, discussed and animated the principles of Gestalt psychology. However, for better clarity, I'd like to explain a more detailed understanding of them. Now, the law of prognons, also known as the law of simplicity or law of good figure, is the cornerstone of Gestalt psychology. It states that when people are presented with complex or ambiguous visual stimuli, they tend to perceive them in the simplest form possible. And this principle serves as the foundation for many of the other Gestalt laws that guides and interprets complex or ambiguous visual stimuli. Now, the key Gestalt principles include 1, proximity, where objects that are close to each other are perceived as belonging together. And this simplifies visual scenes by reducing the number of perceived groups. Second one is similarity. So objects that share similar characteristics such as color, shape, and orientation are perceived as belonging together, creating a sense of unity. Continuity is where we prefer to perceive continuous lines and curves over broken or disjointed ones. And this simplifies the visual field by reducing the number of perceived elements. Enclosure is where incomplete figures are perceived as complete by filling in missing parts, simplifying the visual input, and creating a sense of wholeness. And while these principles are most commonly associated with how we organize visual information, they also help us to explain how we perceive and organize sensory information from other modalities, whether it's filling in the gaps in spoken or sound information to perceive a complete sound. Maybe if the phone is breaking up, you can still make out what's being said. Or when we trick our brain into perceiving touches that are close together on the skin to be part of the same object. Or how similar smells or tastes are grouped together. These principles are responsible for how we interpret sensory information, shaping our perception of the world, influencing our behavior. For instance, we also do this with people, and sometimes the outcome is not so good, but we'll talk about that when we get into social psychology. Although our senses are being stimulated externally, the biological, specifically the neurological processes, are the basis for understanding and interpreting our world. Because everything that is psychological is simultaneously biological. So when sensory information gets to your brain, there are specific regions that are responsible for processing it. Why, you ask? Well, because brain function is localized. So we'll talk about the brain's primary sensory areas. First area we're going to focus on is the area for touch, the somatosensory cortex. So that's the region of the brain that allows you to process sensations on the body, on the skin, on the person. Next area is vision, and so the information processed through specialized M&P pathways and through rods and cones will eventually be projected to the region in the back of the brain known as the occipital lobe. Luckily, because of depth perception, we don't see the world as two-dimensional. We see it as three-dimensional using monocular and binocular cues. With hearing, there are two main processing streams. They start from the primary auditory cortex and send one projection to the temporal lobe on the what pathway to concentrate on identification of objects. The other projection is sent to the parietal lobe, which is the where pathway, to process the locations of sounds in more depth. The gustatory cortex is responsible for processing taste, and the olfactory cortex is responsible for processing smell. Now, it's worth noting that all the sensory input except smell travels to the thalamus first and then to the cortical regions. It's suggested this is why smell is so strongly linked to our memories and emotions due to that slight variation.
Jimmy's gotten used to his whole room smelling like sweaty odors. Yep, he's gone nose blind. He thinks it smells fine, but his mom smells this. Luckily for all your hard-to-wash fabrics, there's Febreze Fabric Refresher. Febreze doesn't just mask, it eliminates odors you've gone nose blind to. Break out the Febreze and breathe happy.
So as life goes on at both the cellular level and the humanistic micro level, sometimes our sensory receptors just reach the point where they are over it. And this is what we call sensory adaptation, where our sensory receptors become less sensitive when exposed to a constant stimulus over time. And because of sensory adaptation, we gradually get used to certain sensory inputs when they remain unchanged. A great example is obviously just like the video we watched when you've gone nose blind to the smells you've been around for a long time. Another great example is how our eyes adjust when we move from a dark room to a bright sunlight or a bright room with artificial light, or how our ears adapt when we transition from loud environments like nightclubs or theaters into a quiet place, like in the car when you ride home. And this process has evolved as an advantage, but it comes with both pros and cons. Benefits include preventing sensory overload by allowing us to focus on important stimuli. It also sharpens our senses, helping us detect when we've had too much exposure to something like harmful light or sound levels. However, there are disadvantages. Sensory adaptation can make us less aware of danger if we become quote unquote blind to it, like missing a gradual change in temperature. It may force us to waste energy on irrelevant stimuli, or worse, we might stop enjoying our favorite foods after having too much of them. Attention also plays a major role in how we perceive the world. So again, attention is essential for perception as it allows for us to focus on the most important information from our environment. It's influenced by a number of factors, including our goals, expectations, and emotions. For example, if we're looking for a specific object, we'll be more likely to pay attention to stimuli that match our description of that object. Similarly, if we're expecting to see something, we will be more likely to notice it. And additionally, our emotions can influence our attention in social situations. So if we're feeling anxious, we may be more likely to pay attention to threats in our environment. And examples of attention and perception could include things like when you're driving, you pay attention to the road and to other vehicles around you, but you probably ignore billboards and other distractions along the way. Or when you're having a conversation with someone, you pay attention to their face and their voice, but you're probably ignoring background noise. Or when you're studying, you pay attention to the textbook or notes or materials, but you were hopefully ignoring the other people in the room or the TV in the background. So let's see how well you all can pay attention. Count the number of passes by those that are wearing white in this video.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted. It is available for use in talks, training, and teaching on DVDs from
So did you actually see the gorilla the first time, or were you shocked by seeing it when it played back? You can't see a forest through the trees sometimes, right? But simply put, attention is how our brain can zone in and focus on what's important in our environment. But what happens when our brain is so focused on one thing that it completely misses something else, even something super obvious? Sometimes our attention fails because our attention is limited and we cannot attend to all the stimuli in our environment at the same time. Inattentional blindness is when we're so focused on one thing that we become blind to the other things happening right in front of us. And there are a number of things that can influence inattentional blindness, such as the salience of the stimulus. Salience refers to how noticeable a stimulus is. More salient stimuli are more likely to capture our attention. Our expectations also, and we're more likely to notice stimuli that we expect to see. Also, the difficulty of the task. So if we're engaged in a difficult task, we're less likely to notice unexpected stimuli. So inattentional blindness can be dangerous in some situations as well. For example, a driver who's not paying attention to the road may fail to notice a pedestrian crossing the street. And our perception of the world is shaped by way more than what we are paying attention to in the moment. Our culture, beliefs, values, and past experiences play a huge role in shaping what we see and how we interpret it. For instance, culture shapes the way we interpret sensory information. For example, people from different cultures may perceive colors, sounds, and tastes differently due to varying cultural associations and language. Cultural norms also dictate what is considered important to notice and what can be ignored. Beliefs and values influence how we interpret sensory data. For instance, a person who is highly religious or spiritual might indeed interpret ambiguous stimuli, like a figure in the clouds, as a divine sign, while someone without those beliefs might see it as just a random cloud formation. Prejudices can also lead to biased perceptions. For example, racial biases can affect how we perceive facial expressions and behaviors of people from different racial groups. This can result in misinterpretations and reinforce stereotypes. Our expectations also alter our sensory experiences. For instance, if we expect the food to taste bad, we might perceive it as tasting worse than it actually does. And this is known as the expectancy effect. Finally, personal experiences shape our sensory perceptions by creating unique filters through which we interpret the world. For example, someone who has experienced trauma may be more sensitive to certain sounds or sights that remind them of the traumatic events than someone else would be. Thank you so much for tuning into this part 1 on our lecture on sensation and perception. Be sure to tune into part 2 as we discuss the senses.